Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has tapped one of his Alberta MPs to lead the party's pro-unity campaign ahead of this fall's referendum on Alberta separatism. Dane Lloyd has represented the Edmonton area riding of Parkland since 2017. He also chairs the Conservative Party's Alberta caucus. In a letter to Lloyd, Poilievre wrote, "We can't pretend that Albertans don't have legitimate concerns and grievances." He added, "Our task is not to scold Albertans, it is to hear them." Joining me now is Dane Lloyd, the Conservative Party of Canada's Alberta Referendum lead. Mr. Lloyd, thanks very much for making time for this. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with those concerns, those grievances. I'm curious about your understanding of what's really driving some Albertans to seriously consider leaving Canada. What are Albertans telling you about that?
Well, I think this is an issue that, has existed for quite a long time. But I think particularly in the last 10 years, it's really crystallized into this movement that is upset about a number of issues. And these are legitimate grievances. They're upset about an Ottawa knows best mentality that's increasingly intruding on areas of provincial responsibility. It's on a federal Liberal government that increasingly was playing divide and conquer tactics where they, were putting forward legislation to block pipelines from Alberta. And, a lot of these things have sort of confluenced together to the point where we're having a referendum where we're discussing the possibility that the country may be fundamentally changed. And I think it's a sad point that we're here today, but I'm here to make the case that Alberta's better off within Canada and Canada's better off with Alberta. Let's stay united.
Well, just on that point, you're an Alberta MP. You obviously spent a lot of time back in the province. So how do you respond when you meet someone who is toying with the idea of voting yes this fall, who would like to go down the road of seeing a binding referendum on separation? What is your message to them?
Well, I had this exact conversation at the doors just over a year ago in the election. And what I found really interesting was, people who are sort of saying, well, maybe separation's the answer for all these concerns that we have. And I said to them, but we're still Canadians. And they said, yes, absolutely. So this isn't really a rebuke on Canada. It's a rebuke of Ottawa. And so while I agree that there's these legitimate concerns that need to be dealt with, I think fundamentally Albertans are patriots and we want to keep the country together. We just want it to be better.
Mm-hmm. But does your appeal essentially boil down then to, this is why you need to vote for Conservatives? Or are you also comfortable making the case that Canada is worth fighting for, even when Conservatives aren't in power federally?
Look, Canada is always worth fighting for. And just because there's a Liberal government in power that is doing things that are counter to the values and the interests of Alberta or other regions in Canada, frankly, doesn't mean that we throw out this beautiful inheritance that we've received from generations of our forefathers. Like my ancestors came to Upper Canada in 1783 after the American Revolution, and I'm not going to stand by and, let my frustrations with various federal policies get in the way of throwing away that beautiful inheritance that I've received from my ancestors, that many of us have received. And I want to pass that inheritance on better than I received it to next generations. And so that's why I'm going to keep fighting for better results out of Ottawa. We can make Canada work. We can make Canada work for everyone, particularly for Albertans.
Yeah, that message that you're sending there shows that this debate obviously isn't just about economics, right? It's a deeply emotional question. It's about identity, belonging, whether Albertans feel that Canada is really working for them. I think the separatist camp can relatively easily tap into frustration and grievances. How do you make a similarly, an emotional case for staying in Canada, as you did there, one that resonates with Albertans who feel frustrated, but also without simply reinforcing those grievances?
Well, look, I think the absolute wrong approach to take would be to dismiss the grievances or to denigrate people for having these concerns. These are real, legitimate, valid concerns. And if we don't deal with them in a substantive way, this referendum vote will likely fail, but we're just laying the seeds for future referendum votes, not just in Alberta, but in other regions across Canada. So let's take this seriously, bring action forward to deal with the concerns that Albertans and frankly many other Canadians have so that we can keep our country more united. But it is absolutely an emotional argument because we can talk about the economics of these things. And I think when you're hearing numbers like the billions of dollars that Alberta and Canada could lose out under separation, I don't think that's really tangible for everyday working class people. I think what will really motivate people to show up and vote is to be reminded about this great inheritance, this beautiful country that we've been given, and our duty to make it a better place for future generations.
Obviously, natural resources have loomed large in this debate over many decades, as you alluded to earlier. Ottawa and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith are now working towards building another pipeline to the West Coast. Canadians might once again foot the bill, as they did with the Trans Mountain Expansion project, but public support for oil and gas development appears to be stronger now than it has been in years. How do you think that all changes the conversation, if it does, with Albertans who have long felt that their resources have just been held back too long by Ottawa?
Well, I think the conversation definitely has taken a far less negative turn than we've seen over the past 10 years. And we just have to look at all the geopolitical instability to realize that everyone realizes that oil and gas is one of Canada's critical superpowers. And getting our resources to market is a key way that we can strengthen our country against the threat of tariffs. We can strengthen our currency against inflation and devaluation. It's a key way that we can create jobs and keep taxes low and grow our economy. And so it's good to see that we're having this conversation. But at this point, it's just an illusion. We've had announcements from Prime Minister Mark Carney, and I know Premier Danielle Smith is doing the absolute best job to fight for Albertans' interests by making an agreement to get this pipeline. But the question I have to ask is, why does Alberta have to jump through these special hoops? Why do we have to accept a massive carbon capture plan that will be funded mostly by taxpayers? Why do we have to accept a $130 industrial carbon tax just to get a pipeline built that will frankly benefit this entire country?
Well, there are now several pro-unity efforts underway. Obviously, you're making your case. The Prime Minister has tapped his advisor, Morgan Breitkreutz, to lead the federal government's response. Mr. Poilievre, as I said, has now tapped you to do the same. There are several grassroots groups in Alberta that are now making the case for national unity. Your leader has said that this is a time for unity, not us versus them. So what does that mean when it comes to your party working with the federal government in making the case for Alberta to stay in Canada? What should that cooperation, how should we expect it to look like?
Well, look, in a parliamentary democracy, I view holding government to account as a member of the opposition as being constructive. In a democracy, when we're calling out government for, for their failures of policy, we're doing our job. We're helping make the country better. So by calling out these grievances for Albertans and calling for change, I think that is working with the federal government in our constitutionally mandated way. But whether you're asking, am I going to get on a stage with Mark Carney? I think, that would be exactly what some of the very hardcore separatists would like to see, because they want to present this as a sort of uni-party. Ottawa is here to impose its will, whether it's the Conservatives or the Liberals, to impose their will in Alberta. We're speaking to different audiences. I'm largely speaking to Conservatives in Alberta who believe in our country, and I'm here to try to motivate them to get out and vote in the referendum so that we can keep our country together. Now, Mark Carney and the NDP and various other groups, they're all speaking to their audiences. We have the same goal, which is to keep our country united. But my goal is to also address the very real grievances that I've been fighting for 10 years, that Conservatives have been fighting for decades to get resolved, so that we can have a much more durable and resilient country going forward.
There's been a lot of concern expressed about the fact that this referendum is even happening. We have seen in the past just how unpredictable referenda can be. The Prime Minister has, for his part, called this one in Alberta a quote, dangerous bluff. He has warned about the dangers of unintended consequences. Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has been even more blunt when he was speaking about this last September before the referendum was triggered. He said, and I'll quote here, "It's bananas if we allow a tiny, perennially angry minority to drag the whole province through a deeply divisive debate." You already alluded to this a bit earlier, but what concerns do you have about the consequences that this referendum could have for Alberta, even if separation never happens?
Well, I think the key thing is that we need to have a decisive result in this referendum we're having this fall. We know that this referendum isn't the referendum that will decide whether Alberta will separate or not, but it is a gauge of an indicator on whether the Alberta government will continue with a referendum. And I think it's absolutely critical that people treat this very seriously and that they get out and vote. And when we send that, I think the worst case scenario we could see is very low voter turnout. and a very motivated group of a small motivated group of people getting out and having an outsized impact on that vote. So I think it's very critical that we get people out to vote. And I think, once this issue is dealt with in October, should it be a decisive victory for Canadian unity, we're going to continue the work of building a strong Alberta. We're already seeing some massive investments in Alberta. We're seeing this investment despite the rhetoric of separation. And I think we're going to continue seeing those investments because of our Alberta Advantage strategy that the provincial government's putting forward. And we need to have a federal government that reinforces that by getting out of the way of provincial responsibility.
We are now, though, going to spend the next several months talking about the prospect of Alberta leaving the country. The latest polls suggest that for the time being, about a quarter of Albertans are in favor of starting that process, of going towards that process of having a binding referendum on separation. And of course, we'll need to wait until the fall to see whether that number rises or falls. But regardless, how concerned are you that simply by holding this referendum, that will actually strengthen the separatist movement and leave Alberta and ultimately Canada more deeply divided?
Well, I think, obviously, I wish we hadn't been at this point. I wish we had never gotten to this point. I wish for the past 10 years that we had a federal Liberal government that was more responsive to the frustrations of Albertans. I don't think we'd be talking about a referendum today. But the fact is, here we are. We have a referendum coming forward. Whether or not there's going to be consequences, I think that remains to be seen. But I think a consequence of a decisive result in support of Canadian unity will put this issue to bed. But it will only put this issue to bed if the real legitimate grievances of Albertans are dealt with by this federal Liberal government. We have elected senators who are waiting to get appointed in Alberta. We have critical issues with firearms owners. We have critical issues in the energy sector, agricultural sector. We have a government that's looking at a trade agreement with Mercosur, including Brazil, that could potentially flood our country with foreign beef that will completely destroy our Canadian cattle industry. These are issues not just for Alberta, but they're issues for all Canadians. And so we need a federal government that takes all of these issues seriously so that we can ensure that we don't have future referendums, that we do have future talk of separation in this country.
I'll just close on this because you did say that you wish we were, we weren't in this situation, that the referendum were not taking place. The UCP was elected in the last provincial election explicitly as a federalist party. What responsibility does Daniel, I hear you about Ottawa and how it's been over the past decade, but do you not put any responsibility at the feet of Premier Daniel Smith for triggering this referendum?
Look, I mean, the process is the process, but I think Daniel Smith absolutely has a responsibility to stand up for Canada, and Daniel Smith, the Premier, is standing up for Canada. I know my colleagues in the UCP are standing up for Canada. I'm very proud of them. I'm proud of the work that they've been doing to fight for a stronger Alberta, but also for a more united Canada, and I support them 100%.
Okay, Dane Lloyd, Alberta Referendum lead for the Conservative Party of Canada. We'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.